This was posted on subforum No Sleep on Reddit by user Majestic Firefly. Title: They found my daughter, but something still wants her. July 26, 2022, is a date forever etched in my memory. A day of unbearable loss, the day my precious Morgan was stolen from us. It started like any other sweltering summer day. The heat was relentless, and with all three kids at home, Morgan, my eldest, and her 3-year-old twin brothers, Jack and Milo, I was struggling to keep them entertained. Nursery and school were on break, and we were all restless. To break the monotony, I packed a simple picnic and decided to head to the local park, a place we visited often and loved dearly. The park had always been my sanctuary, a sprawling haven surrounded by woods, buzzing with life and activity. It gave the kids endless hours of joy and gave me some peace of mind. I never imagined it could become the setting for my worst nightmare. After an afternoon of laughter, running, and play, we packed up to head home. As we were walking back to the car, Jack and Milo spotted an ice cream van and, squealing with excitement, took off at full speed. I turned to Morgan, urging her to run with us, but she hesitated, wincing as she said her feet hurt. Gently, I suggested she sit and wait at a nearby picnic table while I got her an ice cream. The table was just behind us. I thought it would be safe. How wrong I was. By the time I paid for the ice creams and turned around, Morgan was gone. The picnic table was empty. At first, I thought maybe she had wandered off nearby, so I looked around, calling her name. The seconds stretched into minutes, and my calls grew frantic. She was nowhere to be seen. My heart thundered as I scanned every corner of the park, shouting for her, asking everyone I passed if they had seen a little girl. But no one had. I dropped the ice creams and started running, screaming her name louder and louder. Panic gripped me as my mind raced through worst-case scenarios. I called my husband, barely able to form coherent words, and then the police. Within hours, a search was underway. The days that followed felt like a living nightmare. Search parties combed the woods, helicopters circled overhead, and volunteers plastered Morgan's picture across town. But as the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. Leads dried up. The police had no evidence, no witnesses. Eventually, the search parties dwindled, and people moved on with their lives. But I couldn't. Morgan was my world, my bright, beautiful little girl with a smile that could light up the darkest room. The world may have forgotten her, but I never did. 2 years had passed since Morgan vanished, and I had long stopped hoping for her return. The grief had settled into me, heavy and unrelenting, and the idea of seeing her again felt like an impossible dream. That's why, when my husband called me a few weeks ago, sobbing and begging me to come to the police station, my first thought was of the worst. "She's been found," he choked out. My heart plummeted. I braced myself for what he really meant, that her body had been found. That after 2 years of uncertainty, at least we'd have answers and a chance to say goodbye. I told myself it was better this way, better than not knowing. But as I drove to the station, my hands trembling on the wheel, I couldn't stop the tears from falling. When I arrived, an officer met me and guided me into a small, quiet room. My husband was already there, his face pale and tear-streaked. The officer began to explain, but the words didn't make sense. "She was found wandering a street near the park," he said gently. "A local shopkeeper recognized her and called us." "It didn't compute. She's alive," I whispered, hardly daring to believe it. My husband shot me a look, a mix of disbelief, relief, and something else I couldn't place. The officer nodded. "Yes, she's alive." My heart felt like it might burst. Relief, hope, and confusion warred inside me. Did she say anything about where she's been, or who took her?" my husband asked, his voice shaking. The officer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She's been through a lot. She's still processing it. All she's really mentioned is someone she calls the shadow man." He paused before adding, We've arranged for therapy sessions to help her adjust. It's important to ease her into things. This will take time. Can we see her? I asked, hardly able to contain myself. My voice cracked, tears threatening to spill over. The officer smiled kindly and led us to another room. And there she was, my Morgan, sitting quietly at a table, looking small and uncertain. My husband ran to her, dropping to his knees and wrapping her in his arms. I hung back for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight of her. She looked just as she had the day she disappeared. Her pink pony t-shirt and blue jeans were the same, right down to the tiny grass stain on the knee. Her blonde curls sat perfectly at her shoulders, exactly as I remembered them. She hadn't grown a single inch. At 6 years old, she'd been petite, but now, at 8, she should have looked different. Her face, her posture, her very presence, it was like time had stopped the moment she disappeared. I shook off the unease, reminding myself that trauma can do strange things. Maybe her time away had stunted her growth, or maybe I was imagining it because of how overwhelming it all felt. But even as I reassured myself, a part of me couldn't ignore the oddness of it all. "Morgan," I whispered, stepping closer. "Sweetheart, it's me." Her eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, they lit up with recognition. She broke into a small, hesitant smile. "Mommy," she said softly. That one word shattered every wall I had built around my heart. I rushed forward, pulling her into my arms, feeling her warmth, smelling the faint scent of her strawberry shampoo. She was here, she was real, and yet, as I held her close, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something about this wasn't as simple as it seemed. As the weeks went on, life slowly returned to normal, or at least, a version of it. Morgan's brothers were overjoyed to have her back, and she slipped seamlessly back into her role as the bright, cheerful older sister. She was the same lovely little girl she'd always been, and soon, I stopped questioning her miraculous return. My doubts faded into the background, buried under the relief of having her home. Morgan was making great progress in therapy. Her psychologist reassured us that the shadow man was likely a manifestation of trauma, a coping mechanism to help her process whatever she'd been through. We were advised not to press her for details and instead focus on creating a safe and loving environment. Just enjoy having her home, the psychologist had said. So, I did my best to let go of the unease that occasionally crept in. But then strange things started happening. One night, I woke in the middle of the night and padded to the bathroom. On my way back to bed, I passed Morgan's room and paused when I heard something, a faint, hushed whisper. My heart skipped. I slowly pushed the door open. "Morgan," I called softly. She was sitting in the middle of her room, legs crossed, her head tilted back. She was staring up at the corner of the ceiling, whispering something I couldn't make out. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and she seemed completely oblivious to my presence. "Morgan," I said again, a little louder this time, stepping inside. Still, she didn't react. I moved closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She blinked then, as if waking from a trance, and turned to look at me. Her expression was calm, even serene, but something about the moment made my skin crawl. "Come on, sweetheart," I said softly, assuming she was sleepwalking. I guided her back to bed, tucked her in, and kissed her forehead. But as I closed her door and went back to my own room, I couldn't shake the image of her staring at that empty corner. The next few nights were the same. I'd wake to the sound of whispers, find her sitting in the same spot, her gaze fixed on the same corner of the ceiling. She always seemed calm, but I couldn't help feeling a growing sense of dread. Finally, one night as I tucked her into bed, I decided to break the rules. Against the psychologist's advice, I asked her about it. "Morgan," I said gently, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Who are you speaking to at night?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she glanced at the corner of the ceiling, as if she was seeking permission to answer. My stomach tightened. I forced a smile and tried a different approach. "Okay, Let's play a game, I said lightly. I'll ask a question, and you just say, apples, for yes and oranges, for no. Sound good? She nodded hesitantly. Is your name Morgan? I asked, starting with something simple. Apples, she said softly. Are you speaking to someone at night? I continued. Apples. Can you say who? Oranges. I hesitated. My pulse quickened as I asked the next question, my voice barely above a whisper. Are they the ones who took you? There was a pause, so long that I thought she wouldn't answer. But then, finally, she said it. Apples. I tried to convince Morgan to sleep in my bed that night. I was terrified, not just for her, but of whatever was happening in that room. The logical part of me insisted it was all trauma-induced, that the whispers and fixation on the ceiling were just her mind's way of coping. But there was something else, something I couldn't explain. A cold, oppressive feeling seemed to hang in the air whenever I was in her room, heavy and suffocating. I felt it too, even if I didn't want to admit it. Morgan refused to leave her bedroom. Her wide eyes stayed locked on the corner of the ceiling, as if something unseen was keeping her there. Every time I tried to coax her out, her distress escalated, her breathing quickened, her small hands gripping the edge of her bed like a lifeline. Finally, I relented. I tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and left her in her room. But I couldn't just let it go. The next day, I installed a baby monitor. I told myself it was for her safety, that I couldn't risk losing her again. But deep down, I knew it was also for my sanity. I needed to see what was happening in that room when the whispers started. Night after night, I sat in my bed, staring at the grainy black and white footage on the monitor. I watched as Morgan sat up in bed, her body rigid, her eyes locked on that same corner of the ceiling. Her lips moved, whispering to the unseen entity. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but it was the same every time, quiet, urgent, and unnervingly calm. I thought about telling my husband, or the psychologist, but every time, I stopped myself. They'd think I was crazy, or worse, that I was feeding into Morgan's delusions. But I knew something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. The next day, while Morgan was at therapy, I decided to search her room. I told myself it was for her safety, that I wasn't betraying her trust, I just needed answers. I tore through drawers, toy boxes, and under the bed, but I found nothing. Then I noticed her diary on the nightstand. I hesitated, guilt twisting in my stomach. But the need for answers outweighed the guilt. I opened it. The first few pages were unintelligible scribbles, chaotic lines and shapes that seemed to bleed into each other. But as I flipped further, the words began to form. The same phrase repeated over and over, scrawled in jagged, unfamiliar handwriting, "Come back. Come back. Come back." My hands shook as I turned the pages. The writing wasn't Morgan's. It wasn't even close. The letters were sharp and uneven, etched deep into the paper as if written with desperation. I slammed the diary shut, my breath catching in my throat. That's when I heard it. A soft creak, the sound of weight shifting on the floorboards behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body locking into place. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin. I didn't dare turn around. My instincts screamed at me to run, and so I did. I bolted out of Morgan's room, slamming the door behind me and not stopping until I was downstairs. Whatever took her wanted her to come back. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed help. Real help. I'm going to tell my husband as soon as he gets home.